All right, thanks, folks. Thanks, Al, for the lovely introduction. It's great to be here. As I said, yeah, my stats lecturer would be just wondering where the world went wrong, 20 years ago, thinking about how I got here. So perhaps just some really brief introductions. Yep, thank you, Al, for mine. I'm the Managing Director of Springpoint. We're an OD consulting firm. We focus on creating scale change in organisations through leadership, culture and capability solutions. When I was asked to come and support this awesome event, I couldn't think of anyone better to bring along with me than Brooke, who will introduce herself in a moment, and to talk about this topic, which is really, I guess, very much a practitioner's session in a way to talk about the gap between great data, which we have so much of, and creating change. And Brooke is someone who I've worked with closely as a colleague and as collaborators now on a number of really important projects for some important companies who equally values data and action, and that was the best way I could think of Brooke. But perhaps just it'd be great to hear a little bit about you and your role, because you've seen a lot. So do you want to start by just sharing a little bit about your background, Brooke, before we jump into it?
Very kind words, Dylan. So yes, good morning all, or good afternoon. I am Brooke Lewis. I am currently the Director of Organisational Development for CSIRO, so Australia's National Science and Technology Agency. Our aim and our purpose is really around being an innovation catalyst in solving Australia's greatest challenges through science, technology and engineering. So it means pretty busy times for us at the moment as we're on the forefront of coronavirus, bushfires, climate change. So no 2 days are the same, I can tell you, and 2020 has definitely started off in a very, very different light to how we thought this year was going to kick off. So, so my role encompasses all those things in the organisational development space: culture, engagement, learning, leadership, talent. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple of our diversity, inclusion and portfolio, including our Indigenous folks, and our change part of the organisation as well. So definitely lots of things are changing and lots of things are moving for us. So
a lot happening.
Having along.
So I realised as I came on I didn't get the clicker. I've got about 2 slides, so I should get the clicker. But as I said, thanks, Al. Yeah, when thinking about what we could, meaningfully engage on, as I said, Brooke and I have worked together a lot in the past in a bunch of different forms, and right now at CSIRO. And what we really wanted to talk about is, I guess, this concept that we've got. Al mentioned it right out of the gate, as he said, that we've got a massive amount of data at the moment. We've never had so much data, but in our own lived experience in the roles that we're in, perhaps in your own personal life, but also more broadly, is that data turning into intended, scaled and meaningful change? What's the gap between those two things? So we want to talk at a pretty practical level about things that we've seen, and in particular Brooke's seen in her number of roles over periods of time, and particularly now at CSIRO, a super data-rich organisation.
Scientists love data.
Yeah, they love data. So, wow, now I'm going to fork out the clicker. Here we go. No. Yes, here we go. So, I think there's a really nice framing quote up there. There are still many areas in which being data-driven is more of a hope or an illusion than an actual reality. One of these areas is work, where human intuition, serendipity and bias are still stronger currencies than data. So my background's in organisational psychology as well, and I've got a really passionate interest in sort of cognitive bias as one angle on the misuse of data at different times. So we might even touch on that a little bit today. A little bit of context. I mean, you don't need too much around this, but as I said, we've got so much data, but how are we using it? So we could go on about how much and how well data is being used for quite some time. But I guess there's a key thing up there, this concept of dark data. Broadly, organisations have a stack of stuff now. But how much of it is being used? That stat from Gartner down the bottom would suggest nowhere near as much. And many of you are working in organisations now who you're actively working with data sets, so you would have a sense of that. Some other sort of data points, if we get into the sort of people space, Brooke and I, as practitioners working in the culture and leadership space, bottom left-hand side, we surveyed our clients last week just by chance. We had a sort of a conference like this, and of the sort of, the people there in the HR and OD space, the question was, does your organisation have a consistent, well understood definition of leadership? Definition of leadership being something that would help us be able to measure and track and think about effectiveness. And nearly 90% of them don't. These are great companies that we're talking about. They're not small organisations who haven't invested in stuff. So and up the top, this sort of overlapping and sort of conflation of different ideas around culture and engagement is another issue. So not all of the story, but just some things related to this idea of how we go about using data. I said I'd ask Brooke a quick question, and I'm going to do it before we really jump into our sort of 20 minutes of show and tell. But Brooke, are there any areas of your life where your use or misuse of data personally is either really good or not so good? Are there any cognitive biases that you have in play around how you go about using data?
I'd love to say, of course not, but that's not true. I would say that I'm a reformed. Everything takes 20 minutes. So obviously there's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, and I am a habitual, particularly my personal life, always thinking that things only take 20 minutes, but actually no, that's a linear line that is not changing. That's been well proven since sundials, not even with Apple watches, but I seem to be thinking that I'm going to change that model, but that is definitely not changing. So yeah, that would be one of my
just
areas.
Packing too much in.
A little bit, yeah.
Well, I said I'd give one. Mine is I've had to stop buying Tats Lotto tickets because I constantly, when I buy one, I start imagining and ideating on what I'm going to do with all of the loot when I've won, and this sort of confidence bias in me, or optimism bias, would probably be the thing I'm really confident. Then when I invariably lose, I sort of go into this sort of depleted state of sort of being for the next day or two. So I'm out of Tats Lotto tickets. So there's one of my biases in my access and use of data. So how we're going to sort of run the next 20 minutes is really, just me asking Brooke a bunch of questions. But we sort of got together, and we have been working together for a while on some really interesting work to talk about some broad areas and where we see, challenges in the translation of data into valuable change. So I'm going to present these sort of broad areas, and then we're going to sort of talk around those a little bit. And hopefully, I guess you could call this a working model that hopefully you'll be able to apply and see some relevance to in your own workplaces. So, I think Al talked well to this idea of how do we translate data into knowledge and knowledge into insight and sort of insight into action. So we've sort of got this frame up here, which is sort of talking to some of the key areas that we think are really important in that. And this sort of first one we talk about is confidence. How do we have our stakeholders in an organisation confident that the data that they have says something about the real world and reflects a real phenomenon? So, a really important one, and tends to be influenced by the volume of data. Have we got enough behind it? Have we got the integrity of data within it? So it's a real construct, and we're getting that well. So, how do we create confidence within stakeholders? Our next one that we will talk about is clarity, and can be the opposite. We have so much data. How do we take meaning from that? We see but that being influenced by the ability to create meaning out of data through thematics and obviously data visualisation, which is not new, but as a practitioner and as someone who works in organisations, and we still have a way to go about starting to tell a story. Next one's around connection. So how do we help organisations, leaders, decision makers, and individuals and teams take performance relevant meaning from data? So there's two parts to that. How do we create meaning from data, and how does that connect to performance? And Adrian's conversation right there with us was about a strong connection to performance. So how do we help that? And we're sort of saying, well, there's some great research and evidence that's been done over the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. How do we apply evidence-based frameworks to data sets to help shape meaning? And then finally, this idea around commitment. And Brooke and I have been talking a lot about the fact that often data gets used for measuring current state. And we've been really, there's a lot of work happening, and Brooke's got some great stories around how do you start to think about it as a change tool in itself and apply it in such a way that it's seen as something that's personally empowering for people, and that includes liberalisation of data and people having access to it at the right time. So they're the sort of 4 areas we're going to talk around, and I'm going to put another slide up, which I'm not going to talk to, but it's sort of a backdrop for some of the do's and don'ts, and Brooke's going to bring some real practical to that. So let's start with this idea of confidence, Brooke. Having leaders and individuals be confident in data. What are some of the things that you've seen as either good practice or not so good practice, and what sort of impact has that had in organisations you've been in?
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate for really putting useful data in the hands of the leaders and those in the organisation who are actually going to be using it. Not novel, I know I didn't come up with that idea, but definitely a big advocate for it. So at a prior organisation that I was at one of our large Australian insurers, we had spent quite a bit of time coming up with almost a prototype of a culture leadership kind of dashboard that was that we had prototyped, built it internally, and really no more than 12 kind of questions that were really asked of the organisation quite frequently. So it started off monthly, so I think that there was definitely a number of lessons that we're learning in that, in terms of moving through prototyping mode and then trying to get something to hit scale. But one of the biggest, probably the lessons there, was really around, in the interest of keeping it simple, we might have oversimplified it a little bit too far.
Tell us about that.
So we had a single point measure so the organisation measured NPS, so Net Promoter Score for customers. So we wanted to take an approach from a people and employee perspective that was very, very similar to that. So we applied an ENPS measure across the organisation as one of the
engagement employee Net Promoter Score.
Net Promoter Score.
Yep, okay.
Yeah. So we chatted to Bain and a few others, etc. Anyway, we had landed then on a single data point as the indicator for that sort of that measure. Can I say that I inherited it at this point in time?
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is all about learning. Al said that.
Well,
this is about learning.
There was definitely learnings in terms of getting underneath it and understanding how we had built that. But really, so of course it had some volatility within it, and you definitely heard a lot of noise in the system and across the organisation around sort of on the volatility. How do we respond to it, etc., etc. So really what we did was we focused in and really wanted to work to make sure that we had gained the confidence of those that were using the data, both the people who were answering the questions across our people and our leaders. So what we looked to do was basically change that from a single data point to a 3 data points to make up that score, and then that started to even out some of the volatility, and really. So
can I just check? I think the challenge you're saying is, hey, we tried to, and this was often what we see in this conference, we're trying to simplify a stack of data, and so what we've done is we've created a single data point, but then you're saying, hey, there's volatility in that data point, and we're perhaps taking meaning from that, we had up here this concept of perhaps seeing even causality in that, seeing that that's actually saying something meaningful when you're saying actually maybe the construct behind it wasn't deep enough or measured well enough.
Yeah. So instead of so really the focus was to make sure that there was then confidence in the organisation or by the organisation in the measure. So we sought then to change that, and of course that then did 2 things really around. We were clear about what we wanted to measure, so that through that exercise we really kind of built our own confidence back in the measure, as well as got the confidence of those that were using it. Along the way.
So it sounds like a bit of learnt experience about what a single data point and how to sort of maybe get a bit deeper on that. And I won't ask people to put their hands up in the room, but we've all been in organisations, all been supporting work where whether it's employee engagement can get boiled down to a single metric, and we sort of start using that. And even more broadly, if we look at some of the challenges in recent royal commissions, we've got up there this concept of the panarchy principle, which is a principle that sort of says, hey, sometimes we focus on one data point to the detriment of improving the system more broadly. So it's a really interesting idea that, we might be really focused on whether it's engagement or whether it's customer or whether it's, even if it's profitable, whatever it is, but we know that organisations and people are systems and need balance in the way that we look, balance and integrity in the way that we look at data. So, nice one. So let's keep moving. I know we're on a tight time schedule, and I'm sort of keeping my eyes out to make sure I think I'm about halfway through at the minute. So the next one, we discussed a little bit, Brooke, and it's actually in some ways born out of the opposite. How do you create clarity in an organisation about what matters when you've got a bunch of staff? And so, what have you seen or practiced that are sort of examples of that working well or not so well?
Yeah. So I mentioned before, yes, our scientists and scientists at CSIRO are no different in terms of their passion for data. So this is something that we're working on at the moment. So there's been a deep investment over the last 4 or 5 years on engagement across CSIRO. It is, and it's worked well. So a highly engaged workforce, very much driven around our purpose. Year-on-year improvements that most organisations would really kind of be would be a little bit green with envy for. So the approach has been very data rich. So annual survey that obviously goes deep in terms of its question set. And then that has also been bolstered and added to by a series of workshops and roundtables and focus groups and you name it. There's sort of
and is there measurement coming out of those things too?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, just for good measure. We're probably actually at a point where you would call it data rich, but I'm probably feeling at this point in time that we've probably moved to being a bit more data dense in terms of trying to make sense of actually what are the critical things that we need to be focusing on. So my mind has really kind of gone to what's the opportunity lost in terms of, so the engagement has served the organisation particularly well, but particularly as we lean into a more challenging year in terms of our priorities and in terms of where we need to spend our time, how is it that what is it the opportunity that we could actually start to turn our mind to? And so the focus, could it be a focus on engagement, or is it a focus on culture that might be right? Is it a focus on ensuring our people are feeling happy about the work that they're doing? Or is it a focus on identifying a culture and driving towards a culture that's much more empowered and really connected to its purpose more deeply? And you can probably guess which side of the fence that we're looking at really, sort of in terms of shaping much more around culture. And for us, like most organisations, I think at this point in time, one of our strategic pillars is around driving collaboration. And of course, that's because we about our part in the Australian ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, and that I'd like us to, or we are starting to move to a point where we're getting deep insights around the cultural barriers and enablers that will really kind of fast forward us and fast track us on collaboration, for example.
So yeah, it sounds like that really deep zoom in and massive amount of data there has certainly created a level of focus, but perhaps not, has distracted in some ways around clarity about what, as you said, what the broader opportunity is. And I think we all can experience this. If you're faced with a myriad of data, you've got a couple of choices as a decision maker, an individual. One is to consume it all and create themes and really invest time in it, or the other is just to pick out the data points that are most salient to you, either deliberately or not so, and sort of have this sort of confirmation bias type concept. So we certainly see that happening at times. So it's sort of saying more of the how do we elevate thematic analysis, not a new concept, but as a practitioner, I certainly see the opportunity for us to do that more. What are the key themes here, and how do we visualise rich data source to improve consumption? I think is another thing. So Al.
On that theme, with Insight 222, one of the first projects we took on, actually it was the first project, was to create an ethics charter.
Yeah.
Because many of our member companies did not have effectively a set of gateways that had to be crossed to determine whether something was appropriate. In other words, did it erode trust? Did it perpetuate bias? Did it compromise a certain group? To Your question, Brooke, do you have anything like that in place, or is that being discussed right now around having some wickets, if that's the right use of the word, on making sure people analytics projects are appropriate and are going to hit the mark?
Yeah, so I think the organisation has been particularly strong around governance and code of conduct from a sort of science research kind of perspective. But I think so that's where one of the concepts that we're discussing in the organisation at the moment around how we sort of drive that forward. We've also got a people analytics and insights team that's sort of moving from that reporting mode to insights and analytics. So we're kind of doing this in partnership with them. And that, so yes, it's a hot topic for us at the moment that we're really tackling across the organisation, and trying not to do it just within our world of OD and within the people analytics, but actually doing it with the organisation and through the organisation. Yeah.
Cool. So moving on to our next one, it's really around this idea of connection. So talk about how do you take insight or thematic data and create meaning and connect it to performance. I know we've been talking about that a bit recently. I'm really interested in your shares around the things you've tried to do more of in your roles to help connect people to data and to connect an organisational story, I suppose, in many ways around what it means and what we should do.
Yeah. So there's probably a couple of examples that come to mind. If I carry on with the same theme that I was just speaking about in terms of culture. So in moving to a culture framework or a culture approach at CSIRO, we're implementing a framework, of course, but what we're looking to do is, so of course we'll use our engagement data and other data engagement data points and map that against our culture framework that we would like to use. But we're also starting to do some thinking around actually what are the other measures and other indicators and other data points in the organisation that are outside of the typical people's world, and actually map those as either lead or lag indicators. So my ideal space here is really around so that we've got a number of different cultural measures that are telling us around what's happening, which is supported both by how people feel on the ground on a day-to-day basis in terms of what's happening for them in terms of the work environment and the context that they're working in, but at the same time that's then also supported with data points that are not in the traditional people space.
Yeah, so it's a piece of, I mean, Brooke and I have certainly been talking about that, and I guess as someone who comes from a background around organisational psychology, it's something I've been quite passionate about. I mean, like many of you, you'll have the things that you use, the tools and frameworks that you use and feel more comfortable with that hopefully bring a sort of a level of evidence base to help you sort of aggregate data in a particular way, tell a story that's relational, how particular people phenomenon, connect to each other, but then how they connect to organisational performance and how that's shown to be the case, over time, hopefully. So, I guess I'm pretty passionate about, using whatever works, as long as it's got an evidence base, but making sure that we don't not connect that data up and don't not use the sort of research that's been before us. I was at a conference, I reckon 10 years ago, when Dave Ulrich was saying, hey, we don't need any more data, we need more networks of data and people connecting up to create meaning through that data. And we've got a lot of great research out there that we're doing some work with some wonderful universities as well to try and form collaborative networks to connect theory, research and evidence to real world. So yeah, I guess it's a big encouragement point for any way that you can make sure you overlay that, because sometimes we find ourselves, and I've certainly been in this boat before, solving problems that have been solved by someone else before. So I guess that this create a connection and story through evidence-based application is a really important one.
The biggest one there, I think, for us too is as we really crystallise what are the right organisational cultural levers that we want to focus on and which ones of those are the right priorities, is around reconnecting back with the executive and the leadership group who are really leading the organisation. So I think at the moment that we've got an opportunity to also make sure that we're creating that connection between the data is helping to give us the insights, which is then telling us what are the right cultural priorities and levers that are really going to unlock our organisational strategy and therefore the performance. So I think for me that that connection and that narrative that becomes really, really crystal clear for the executive group is really key too.
Yeah. I think I know we haven't got much longer and we've got an area to cover, but I can't help but tell this story because it sort of connects in time to me probably connecting with Al perhaps 10 years ago when he was, he was up the front. He was sort of super passionate about this idea of how do we use the data that we've got, even though it might be a bit crap at times, to create a story to sort of position for positive change. Now we're at a different point. We've got so much data, but he was sort of like, right now, as a people community, we're not sometimes doing a great job of using the data that we have to make to create some stories. But really importantly, how do we make sure those stories connect to people and to the organisational drivers and outcomes, the performance outcomes that we're striving for. So I hear your point around connecting it, and often I see that as a practitioner, culture or engagement data being a conversation about people, not about how people connect to performance, and I guess the connection between those two things, as I said, similar to Adrian's conversation before, there's a mutually interdependent relationship between those two. So on to our last one, commitment. We're talking about this idea that how do we create commitment to change, and there'll be other angles on commitment that we could talk about here, but one is how do we not just look at data as a way to get information to create a baseline, but how do we think about it as a change, a tool that helps change in and of itself. There's some amazing tech out there that's really helping this. I'm interested in your views on what you've seen in this space.
Yeah, so this one, my mind probably goes back to where we were running this dashboard. As I said, I'm a bit of an advocate for dashboards, but so we're running the dashboard that was really focused on driving some organisational and culture and leadership-based change across the insurer, and obviously the Hayne Commission was underway at the time, so it was probably quite topical. But really, so there's probably a couple of things here around actually driving commitment. So one was, I also don't want to walk away thinking this was very easy. It was, this was a 3.5 years time in which we'd introduced the dashboard in the organisation. We were continuing to review it, iterate it, pulse check how it was being received and what was then being done with the data over time. So probably there's two things to come to mind here around in terms of driving commitment, and that is one around consistency. So whilst we weren't consistent in what we stuck to, but we were consistent in that it kept going out, and we made iterations and changes, and we really communicated quite strongly across the organisation around what was changing and why we're trying to change it for the better and improving it. And the other part was frequency. So in an environment where the leaders had the regular dashboards, they also had all other, finance, whatever kind of other data, coming at them. We, at that point in time, in the first, before we sort of made some bigger changes, the data was being pulse checked every month. Obviously, leaders were then getting the results within a week later. So every month they were getting the same data come through. And I guess in checking in on how it was being used, the sentiment was really that it was probably a little bit too often and too much. So it meant that as a leader, you might have seen it, but then a month kind of flies by and oh my goodness, that pulse check's running again. So of course there's not enough time for them to actually do something with it, which of course was driving a bit of a sentiment in the organisation around you're asking us but you're not changing anything, all of that type of stuff, and that sort of typical survey overload. So really, it sounds very simple, but at the time we basically made a couple of changes, and that was really to change the frequency, so we moved to bi-monthly, and the biggest impact that had most notably was really around leaders feeling empowered to talk with their teams, to be able to make changes within the teams at a local level. That was of course supporting some of the organisational goals, but also that the participation rates also started to increase again as well, so that people felt like there was things were being done, so therefore they wanted to participate back in it again. So very simple probably example, I think, that one. But to be honest, I think you can be looking for the complex solutions to what actually could be quite simple at times. And so for me, really finding the right rhythm that works for the organisation, so that they can take the data, use the data, do something with the data. That is, was definitely probably one of my strongest lessons so far.
I think that's probably the theme. I think we're sort of at time now, but I guess the theme, in here is, hey, this is an emerging frame to start to think about the sort of practices and maybe the sort of areas you need to be thinking about to make sure that as much of the great data that you have is turning into intended change. And I love that one around saying, hey, what's the regularity in which we're giving something to people so they can actually act on it rather than it becoming a distraction, like every app that you've got that's giving you a buzz that you go, hey, I haven't done anything, so all of a sudden it's just a background noise. So I think there's a key theme, and I'm sure there's other things in there. Thank you, Al and Lara, for the opportunity to be here, and thank you, Brooke, for sharing what I think is some great practice-based insights in just some of the things that can be done to really improve the way we're using data. So thank you.
No, you're welcome. It's great to be here. Thank you.